Good afternoon, and I feel privileged to be here this afternoon. And this is my first trip to South Korea, and I've had a few days to tour your country, and I'm looking forward to seeing more of it. This afternoon, I'm going to go from talking about the very big picture of the universe to talking about the Smithsonian Museum and talking about what we're doing as far as education. And what I'm going to talk about specifically is the role of museums in education. Oops. During my presentation, I'm going to talk about three questions: what the role of museums is in education, and probably most of us today think about museums as a place that you go. It's an event. It's a particular time and place, and you go with your family and your friends or with a school group, and it's something you look forward to, but it may stand apart. It may stand as a particular event or something that you do. And I want to talk about that and maybe rethink that as a role in education. So we'll talk a little bit about how it's changing. And as part of changing, we're going to talk about, in order to change, how the Smithsonian is starting to work with different partners and how we work with those partners. I don't know how many of you have visited the Smithsonian, but this is the first Smithsonian. It's often called the Castle. And it was created in the mid-19th century, and the purpose of the Smithsonian was for the increase and diffusion of knowledge. So the increase of knowledge was research, to learn more about the world, to gain new understandings. And the diffusion was to share that knowledge broadly. And that remains what our mission is still today. Although in the mid-19th century the Smithsonian started as one building, the castle that I just showed you, it has grown. And so now if you're to come to Washington, D.C., this is what's referred to as the Mall, and it stretches all the way from Congress almost to the White House. And along both sides of that mall, you'll find museums. You'll see museums that study anthropology, that study history, that study science, that study art, and researchers who are working on that. So today the Smithsonian includes 19 museums, most of them in Washington, D.C., but also in New York City. It includes 9 research centers in science that are distributed around the world. And it also includes 136 million different objects. So within the collections, within the walls of those institutions, we have 136 million things. They may be artworks, they may be historical artifacts made by people, they may be specimens, but all of those things tell us something about the world and how humans have changed it. So in terms of looking at the big history that was talked about earlier, the Smithsonian would certainly have a huge collection to help to understand that. When you think of museums, whether it's the Smithsonian or any other museum, what makes them unique, which gives them a unique learning opportunity, is their collections. And in the case of the Smithsonian, we have a broad reach of collections for understanding the world. We have images from space because we have the Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory. We have tiny specimens, whether it's collections of ants or beetles from all over the world in natural history. We have live animals at our zoo. And then we have artworks at some of our art museums, whether Asian art, African art, contemporary art, portraits, or American art. And we have artifacts that represent what people have done in this world, things they have made, and those artifacts represent many cultures. With those collections, we have researchers. We have about 1,000 people who are full-time researchers at the Smithsonian in all of those different disciplines that I mentioned, in anthropology, in the sciences, in history. And these researchers are looking at the very smallest of living things through the microscopes to looking up to the universe. And we have research sites, not only the 9 research sites I mentioned, but we're working collaboratively with people all over the world. So whether it's looking at the smallest particle or looking at the infinite universe, the Smithsonian is studying it in some way. Now the challenge that we have as educators is you have 136 million things, and you have researchers, 1,000 different researchers doing work, And our problem is to interpret that, for educators to understand what is possible with the collections and also what's going on in the research, and to see how we can make that useful to the public. How can we help to interpret it for the public? So we are the bridge, really, as educators, between all of the resources that are available. So I want to talk a little bit about what we know about when people visit museums, whether it's the Smithsonian or other museums, from visitor research. What is it that they enjoy about that experience? What are the common parts of an enjoyable experience in a museum? And the first is that people choose. We know from visitors that it's interest-driven. And the people who most enjoy going to museums are people who chose to go there. And they go with a purpose in mind. They go because they love art. They go because they love science. They go because they're interested in animals. But it's an interest-driven organization. And so often it's compared with schools, where when you go to school, there are certain things you have to know, and it may be in a particular order that you need to learn them. Whereas when you go to a museum, it is the individual who is really driving what they're learning. We also know that once people come based on their interests, that how they choose to experience a museum is different for every single person who comes. That people who come through each follow their own path. They go from, I'm interested in this, to that, I may go over here. They will not always follow the sequence that is planned by the curator. We know that they will spend different amounts of time based on their interests. So they may spend 10 minutes here and they may walk by the next exhibit. But the particular path that they choose, driven by their interests, is chosen by the individual going through the museum. We know that when people visit, an important part of that is the social experience. They want an opportunity to talk to each other. There needs to be an exchange. They like to talk about what they're looking at. So education at the Smithsonian, or education in any museums, is often based on choice, free choice of people deciding what to do, about an opportunity to explore, finding their own paths, and also a chance to talk with someone else about that particular experience. Now, I think all of those things remain true at museums, but they're also changing. Just as our world changes, so are museums. This is a picture of our first secretary of the Smithsonian standing in front of the castle, and this is Joseph Henry. And when they put the statue of Joseph Henry in front of the castle, they had him turning towards the castle with his back toward the public. And that was intentional. The reason they did it is because they thought that the scholarly life was a life of looking inward, in some sense shutting out the outside world so that you could focus, so that you could engage with your research. What happened in the mid-60s is a then secretary of the Smithsonian took Joseph Henry on his pedestal and turned him. And he turned him so that he would face out into the world. And the reason he did that is because it was a statement. He was saying, the Smithsonian is no longer just about looking inward, it's about looking towards our audience. It's about trying to understand what they want to know and what their experience will be, to be a more open institution. So if you were to come to the Smithsonian today and enter from what is the mall entrance, you would see Joseph Henry, and he would be out there greeting you today as you were to come in order to welcome you. That shift in museums from being focused inwardly to looking out changes everything about what happens inside its doors, because it is no longer about us just telling you something. It's about an experience. It's about you doing something once you come in the doors. And it's no longer about a single experience or a single path. It's about people personalizing what they do, making even more choices within about how they want to understand, how they want to interact with that environment. So now you see in museums activities where parents can interact with their children, where school groups are having different kinds of experiences, where adults are doing things within our galleries. It's a much more active place than it's been in the past. So one change is the shift to looking at the audience, and I think another huge change that you see is a change for what's happened with the impact of technology. Just as technology has had an impact on all of our lives and what we do, it has impacted what happens in the museums. If you're to go through our museums now, and perhaps your museums as well, you often see teenagers sitting with their mobile devices. They're sitting with their phones and they're text messaging or they're answering emails. And at times this has been a concern for the curators and for the educators, that if you're in the museum, that mobile device might be a distraction, that it's going to pull you away from actually looking at what's in our collections, what the possibilities are. And so, although that mobile technology provides an opportunity, it also provides a challenge to figure out how are we going to use it in a way that it actually enriches the museum experience and engages the public when they come through our doors. This is a quote from Henry Jenkins, who has been a thought leader probably in the use of technology and is currently at the University of Southern California. And he said, "The key is to produce something that both pulls people together, that connects them, and gives them something to do, that makes them active." And so as I go through the rest of the presentation, that's really what we're trying to do, is how are we going to engage them so they're active, not passive recipients, but active in that museum experience, and how are we going to connect them to other people as well. So what we've added to it is it's not just about choosing, exploring, and talking anymore. It's still about that, but it's also about creating visitors who come through the doors doing something, adding something to it, creating something new that wasn't there before, about sharing. So how are they going to share what they did, either with other people who are in the museum or people who are at home? And how are they going to stay connected afterwards? So it's not just a moment, but it's a relationship that we're building. So those are the changes that we're looking at. Now, in order for us to do this, we have a lot we're doing already with our existing research and the management of our collections and the greeting people through the door. And just as perhaps you're finding, we have the same challenges in terms of having resources. There aren't more resources to fulfill these new functions. So one of the ways we're doing it is through partnering. And we strategically try to choose those partners who are going to bring expertise that we may perhaps don't have so that we can better meet the needs of our audiences. So in the next part of my presentation, I'm just going to give you 3 examples. Now, we have many kinds of partnerships across the institution, and I'm just focusing on one. I'm focusing on partners with technology providers. It doesn't mean that there aren't other partners we value as well. There certainly are. Perhaps partners that give us access to networks of teachers, perhaps partners that give us access to other kinds of resources. But in this particular one, because I think that technology has had such a fundamental impact, or can have, on our institution, I'm only focusing on technology partners for this presentation. The first is we have partnered with a foundation, and that's Pearson Foundation, in order to create mobile laboratories for teens.